There's a moment, and I don't think people talk about this enough, when you're standing outside Buckingham Palace and you suddenly realize that the building isn't just stone and iron. It breathes. It watches. It remembers. I know that sounds strange, but stay with me. Because what I witnessed on that gray Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of morning where London can't quite decide if it wants to rain or just threaten to, changed something in me permanently. Not because it was dramatic in the Hollywood sense, not because anyone fired a gun or screamed in a corridor, but because the truth of what happened moved so quietly through the palace walls that most people standing right next to it didn't even notice. I noticed, and I'm going to tell you exactly what I saw. The morning it all started. Let me set the scene properly, because the atmosphere matters here. It was the 23rd of October, a Tuesday, the kind of day that arrives in London wearing its grayest coat, the sky sitting low and heavy over the city like it had somewhere better to be but wasn't quite ready to leave. The trees along the Mall were beginning to lose their leaves, not dramatically, not all at once, but in that reluctant English way, one or two at a time, like they were giving up slowly. I'd been in London for 11 days at that point. A working visit, I won't say more than that, and I'd found myself near the palace on more mornings than I'd originally planned, simply because the area had a pull to it that I couldn't explain. There's something about standing near a place where history actually happened, not where they put a plaque saying history happened, but where you can almost feel the decisions still echoing in the air. That morning I was near the north side, off Buckingham Gate, nursing a coffee from the little shop on the corner that I'd discovered on my third day. The coffee wasn't extraordinary. The view was. There were tourists, of course. There are always tourists. A group of Italian schoolchildren was moving in a sort of loosely controlled chaos near the Victoria Memorial, their teacher, a small, round-faced woman in a red coat, waving her arms like she was conducting an invisible orchestra. An American couple near the gate was taking photographs of everything, including, at one point, a pigeon. An older Japanese gentleman stood perfectly still with a camera on a proper tripod, patient as stone, waiting for exactly the right angle of light. The guards at the gate stood the way they always stand, like they'd been placed there by a set designer, not born, back straight, eyes forward, not blinking at anything the tourists did, which, that morning, included a small child pressing his face against the fence until his cheeks went flat. Normal morning. And then it wasn't. The guard named Thomas. I didn't know his name then. I learned it later, pieced it together from different people. From a conversation with a palace staff member I happened to speak with at a nearby cafe. From a retired aide who I'll call Margaret, though that's not her name, who had worked within the palace system for over 20 years and still walked with the posture of someone who had once been told to straighten up and never forgotten. His name was Thomas Ashworth, 26 years old, third-generation military family. His grandfather had served, his father had served, and Thomas had enlisted the moment the age and the paperwork allowed him to. Not because someone pressured him into it. He wasn't that kind of man. He'd chosen it the way some people choose a vocation. Quietly, certainly. He'd been posted to the main gate rotation for 8 months by the time October arrived. Long enough to know the routine down to the minute. Long enough to recognize the faces of the regular morning staff who entered through the side gates. Long enough to notice when something was off. And something that October morning was very much off. I didn't see it first, not exactly. What I saw first was his eyes. Now, I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. But I've spent enough time watching people, professionally, personally, to know when someone is tracking something specific. When eyes that are supposed to be fixed forward make a small, deliberate adjustment and then return, so quickly that most people would swear the guard hadn't moved at all. Thomas's eyes moved like that, twice, in the space of about 40 seconds. Both times they shifted barely, just barely, to a point somewhere behind and to the left of where I was standing. Behind me, across the courtyard approach, there was a black car. Not unusual. There are black cars on those streets the way there are black cabs, constantly, unremarkably. But this one had been parked in the same position for longer than made sense for a drop-off or a pickup. Longer, honestly, than the parking situation in that area usually allowed. I turned to look at it properly. Nothing to see. Tinted windows, no visible plates from my angle. Driver's seat occupied, I thought, though I wasn't sure. I turned back. Thomas was looking directly forward again, absolutely still. But I'd seen it. I'd seen the tracking. And something in my gut said, he's been watching that car since before I arrived. What Margaret told me about the days before. I'm going to jump forward slightly here, to a conversation I had 3 days after these events, in a small Italian restaurant 2 streets from Victoria Station. Margaret sat across from me with a glass of sparkling water she barely touched, and told me things in the careful, measured way of someone who has spent decades deciding what can and cannot be said in public. She told me about the days leading up to that Tuesday. There had been, she said, a particular kind of tension inside the palace in the week prior. Not the normal tension of schedules and protocols and the 1,000 moving pieces of royal life. Something different. Something that moved through the staff corridors like a cold draft under a door, felt by everyone, identified by almost no one. It had begun, she believed, with a private meeting. She didn't know all the details. She knew the meeting had taken place on a Thursday evening, attended by very few people, and that the subject of the meeting, at least in part, had involved Princess Charlotte. Now, let me be very clear here. I'm not going to pretend that I have access to palace transcripts or private correspondence. I don't. What I have is the account of someone who was close enough to the situation to observe its effects, and my own observations of what happened in the days that followed. The picture I'm painting is assembled from pieces. I'm telling you that honestly, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes this story worth telling. But here is what Margaret believed, and Margaret, I'll tell you, is not a person given to drama or speculation. She chose her words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. She believed that in the days leading up to that Tuesday, someone close to the upper reaches of the palace hierarchy had been working to position Charlotte in a way that would, and she used this phrase carefully, diminish her standing in a matter of considerable importance to the family's future. She didn't say Camilla's name, not at first. She said, there are people in that institution who understand that the next 20 years will look nothing like the last 20, and not everyone is comfortable with what that means for their own position. I asked her to be more specific. She looked at me over the rim of her glass and said, Princess Charlotte has a quality that certain people find threatening. She listens, she remembers, and she doesn't perform gratitude she doesn't feel. Then she picked up her glass, took a small sip, set it down. That last quality, she said, is the dangerous one. Charlotte. I should talk about Charlotte properly here, because she's the center of this story and I don't want to flatten her into a symbol or a headline. I've seen Princess Charlotte at public events twice. Once at a charity function where she was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, and once more recently, at a formal engagement where she stood slightly apart from the main group with the quiet self-possession of someone who is listening to a room rather than performing for it. Both times I was struck by the same thing. She has her mother's way of making the person in front of her feel like the only person in the room. It's not something you can teach. It's either in you or it isn't. With Charlotte, it clearly is. She also, and this matters to what happened, has an awareness that goes beyond her years. Not in the precocious, unsettling way that phrase sometimes means. More like, she has absorbed the lesson that in her world, everything is a test and nothing is accidental, and she has decided not to pretend otherwise. That quality, that alert, non-pretending quality, was precisely what made her vulnerable in the situation that was building that October. And precisely what would make her, ultimately impossible to trap. The letter. Margaret told me about the letter. I want to say up front, I did not see the letter. I cannot verify its exact contents. But Margaret had seen a copy. She was careful about how she said this, in the way people are careful when they want you to understand that they are not claiming to have done something they didn't. And she described it in enough detail that I believe her account is accurate in its essential shape. The letter was elegant. That's the word Margaret used. Elegant. Not crude, not threatening, not obviously harmful. On the surface, it read as a piece of thoughtful advice. The kind of letter a senior member of a family might reasonably send to a younger member, guiding them on protocol, on public expectation, on the particular complexities of their position in an evolving institution. But underneath the elegance, and this is what Margaret said was so difficult to explain to people who hadn't lived inside that world, underneath it, the letter was a cage. It outlined in careful language a set of expectations for Charlotte's upcoming appearance at a specific formal engagement. The event itself was real, scheduled, significant. But the way Charlotte was being asked to present herself at that event, the things she was being guided to say or not say, the people she was being directed toward or away from, the framing of her role, all of it taken together, would have positioned her not as an emerging figure of genuine standing, but as a supporting presence. Background. Decorative. And the expectations were framed as tradition, as what is done, as what has always been expected. The implication was clear without ever being stated. If Charlotte followed this guidance, she would be fulfilling her role properly. If she deviated, if she was herself, she would be the one causing disruption. She would be the problem. It was, Margaret said, looking at me steadily, the oldest game in the palace. Make the person you want to diminish the author of their own diminishment. What Charlotte did next. Charlotte didn't respond to the letter immediately. This, apparently, was itself noticed and discussed. A response had been expected, promptly, graciously, in the tradition of how these things are handled. The silence that came instead lasted 4 days. 4 days during which, according to Margaret, the atmosphere in certain quarters of the palace tightened perceptibly. Then Charlotte did something that no one had anticipated. She asked for a meeting. Not a quiet, private, informal meeting of the kind that could be easily forgotten or denied. A formal meeting, with minutes, with the correct people present, and this was the part that apparently caused a very long pause when the request was received, with the household's senior legal counsel also in attendance. Legal counsel. Margaret told me this with the ghost of a smile crossing her face for the first time in our conversation. That, she said, was when people understood they had misread her. Because the letter, elegant, unimpeachable, framed as tradition, suddenly looked different with a lawyer in the room. Suddenly it wasn't tradition. Suddenly it was a document, and documents have authors, and authors have intentions that can be examined, questioned, and answered for. Charlotte had turned the cage into evidence. Back to Thomas. I want to come back to Thomas now, because the two stories, Charlotte's story inside the palace, Thomas's story at the gate, are connected in a way I didn't understand until later. That morning at the gate, after I noticed Thomas tracking the black car, I stayed where I was. My coffee went cold. The Italian schoolchildren eventually drifted off toward the memorial. The American couple moved on. I stayed. At approximately 9:47 in the morning, and I know the time because I looked at my phone at that exact moment, for reasons unrelated to what I was watching, the black car's engine started. Thomas didn't move. He didn't look at the car. He did something so small and so precise that I almost missed it even though I was looking directly at him. He shifted his right hand by perhaps 2 centimeters. That's all, 2 centimeters. 30 seconds later, a second guard, who I had honestly not registered as anything other than a standard part of the gate rotation, was on a radio. I couldn't hear what was said. The communication lasted perhaps 10 seconds. The black car pulled away. It turned right, which was away from the palace. I watched it go, then I looked back at Thomas. He was looking forward, completely still, absolutely unremarkable. But his jaw was set in a way I recognized from my cold coffee and my notebook, and my too many mornings spent watching people. He'd been waiting for exactly that. The connection. It took me those 3 days, and the conversation with Margaret, and 2 other conversations I won't detail yet, to understand what the black car had to do with a letter and a meeting and a 20-year-old princess who had just asked for a lawyer. The meeting Charlotte had requested was scheduled for that Tuesday morning. Not in a wing of the palace visible from the gates, not in any location that a camera on the public street could reach, but the meeting was happening that morning inside those walls. And the people who had written that letter, because Margaret believed carefully that the letter had not been composed alone, had reason to want certain things to happen that morning, or not to happen. I don't know what was in the black car. I'm not going to pretend I do. I don't know if it was surveillance. I don't know if it was a messenger. I don't know if it was simply a coincidence that a car sat near the palace on a Tuesday morning while a significant meeting occurred inside. What I know is that Thomas Ashworth tracked it for the entirety of his visible watch, made a signal with 2 centimeters of hand movement, and the car left without incident. And the meeting inside that Tuesday went ahead. What the meeting changed. Margaret didn't attend the meeting. She was clear about that. But she heard things afterward, the way you hear things in institutions where people live and work in close proximity, and the walls, however thick, do not catch everything. What she heard was this. Charlotte had come prepared. She had brought not only the legal counsel but a document of her own, not a response to the letter, something else, something that Margaret described, choosing her words with the care she always chose them, as a record of context. A record of context. I've thought about that phrase many times since. A record of context, not an accusation, not a rebuttal, a context. Dates, conversations, patterns, things that individually might each be explained away. Together, documented, organized, presented by a young woman who had apparently spent 4 quiet days not being silent at all but being very busy. Together they told a story. A clear story. A story that made the elegant letter look exactly like what it was. Margaret said the meeting lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. She said that, when it was over, the people who had written the letter left the room looking, in her words, like people who had sat down to win a hand of cards and discovered halfway through that the other player had been counting the deck the entire time. End of part 1. I'll stop here for a moment, because I think the first part of this story needs to breathe before the rest of it comes. What I want you to carry into the next part is this. A young woman who was supposed to be managed, guided, framed, and quietly sidelined, had instead spent 4 days building something ironclad. A guard at a gate had spent a morning watching a car that had no business being there, and had made sure it left. 2 things separate, connected. And the person at the center of it, Charlotte, had done the most surprising thing available to her. She had told the truth. In a palace built on ceremony, on performance, on the careful architecture of what things appear to be, she had simply told the truth. And it turned out in that room on that Tuesday morning, that the truth had excellent timing. There is more to this story. The days that followed brought things that none of the people in that room had planned for, things that moved beyond the palace walls and into the world. Thomas Ashworth, standing at his gate that morning, had no way of knowing the full shape of what he'd helped protect. But in the way of people who have chosen discipline over convenience and loyalty over politics. He didn't need to. He just needed to do his job. There are things that happen in the middle of stories that only make sense when you reach the end. I know that's a frustrating thing to say when you're in the middle of hearing one, but I want you to understand that everything I'm about to describe, the days between that Tuesday and what came after, felt, while I was living through them, completely ordinary. Just London, just October, just the slow churn of a city going about its business under gray skies. The significance only assembled itself later, the way a photograph develops slowly in the dark, until suddenly the image is there, and you can't believe you didn't see it immediately. So let me take you to Friday. Friday morning, St. James's Park. 3 days after the meeting at the palace, I found myself in St. James's Park. I go there sometimes when I need to think. There's a bench on the east side of the lake, facing the Duck Island cottage, that is almost never fully occupied before 9 in the morning. The pelicans are usually doing something absurd near the water's edge. There's a quality of light there in October, when the leaves have turned and the morning mist is still sitting on the surface of the lake, that feels genuinely otherworldly. Not romantic postcard otherworldly. More like, the city has temporarily forgotten this corner exists and it's yours. I was on that bench at 8:23 in the morning. I had my notebook open, but I wasn't writing in it. I was thinking about what Margaret had told me, and about Thomas, and about Charlotte, and about the strange geometry of how 3 stories, a letter, a gate, a car had intersected on the same Tuesday morning without most of the world knowing any of it had happened. The park was quiet. A few joggers, a nanny with a pram who stopped to take a photograph of the pelicans, 2 men in suits walking fast and talking faster, the way men in suits near Westminster always walk, like the conversation they're having is 1 step ahead of them and they're trying to catch up. Then I noticed the woman on the bench further along the path. She was sitting very still, coat dark green wool, good quality but not showy, hair pinned back neatly, hands folded in her lap, looking at the water. I wouldn't have given her a second thought except for one thing. She was crying. Not making a sound about it. Just the tears were there on her face in the morning light, and she was making no effort to remove them or hide them or perform them. She just sat with them the way you sit with rain. I looked away. It's not my place to stare at someone who is private with their grief. But after a moment I looked back, because something about her posture, the specific quality of stillness in it, reminded me of someone I'd been thinking about. She turned slightly, and I saw her profile. I looked at the path. I looked at the lake. I looked at the pelicans doing something absurd near the water. And I thought, that's either a very strong resemblance, or I am sitting 20 feet from Princess Charlotte. I want to be careful here. I need to stop and be honest with you about something. I am not going to tell you I had a long conversation with her. I'm not going to claim she turned to me and poured out her heart. That's not what happened, and making it up would cheapen the whole thing. What happened was this. I stayed where I was. I didn't move toward her. I didn't take a photograph. The thought didn't cross my mind, and if it had, I'd have been ashamed of myself for it. I just sat on my bench, and she sat on hers, and we were 2 people in a park in the early morning with the lake between us and the city waking up around us. After perhaps 10 minutes, a woman appeared on the path from the direction of the park entrance nearest the palace, mid-40s, wearing civilian clothes but carrying herself with the specific economy of movement that belongs to people who are trained to be useful in emergencies. She walked directly to the bench, said something quiet, and sat beside her. They spoke for a few minutes. I couldn't hear any of it. Then the woman on the bench, the one I believed to be Charlotte, did something I've turned over in my mind many times since. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh, something genuine and brief and a little surprised, like the other woman had said something unexpected and funny in the middle of something serious. The kind of laugh that escapes before you can think about whether laughing is appropriate. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, not elegantly, just practically, the way anyone wipes their face, and stood up, straightened her coat, said something else, The other woman nodded. They walked away together toward the palace-side entrance. I sat on my bench for a long time after that. What Margaret told me about the days after the meeting. When I spoke with Margaret again, we had a second conversation, shorter than the first, over the phone because she was traveling. She filled in some of what had happened in the days between Tuesday and Friday. The meeting, she said, had produced what she called a pause. Not a resolution, not an open confrontation. A pause which, in the vocabulary of palace politics, she explained, was its own kind of outcome. The situation had been too clearly documented, too carefully presented for any immediate countermove. The people who had written the letter, and yes, by this point in our conversation she had confirmed, quietly, that Camilla's advisors had been involved in its composition, and that Camilla herself had been aware of its intent if not every word of its language. Those people needed time to recalibrate. But a pause, Margaret said, is not the same as an ending. And in the days that followed the meeting, there had been what she described as a reorientation of pressure. If Charlotte couldn't be managed by a letter, she could perhaps be managed by environment, by the way information moved around her, or didn't, by the way her upcoming public engagements were framed in briefings she might or might not be included in, by small adjustments to access, who spoke to her, when, about what. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be pointed to as a specific act. Just a climate, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself but settles into your bones over days. Margaret said Charlotte had known what was happening. Of course she had. And the morning in the park, she believed, was Charlotte allowing herself one morning to feel the weight of it before going back in. She's not made of stone, Margaret said. Nobody in that family who's genuinely decent is made of stone. They just can't afford to show it in the wrong places. The park that morning was a right place. The engagement the following Thursday. What I didn't know, when I was sitting in that park on Friday morning, was that the formal engagement referenced in the letter, the event that was the original stage for everything being planned, was scheduled for the following Thursday. Less than a week away. The event itself was a formal reception at a venue I won't name specifically, connected to a charitable initiative that Charlotte had been involved with for some time. It was the kind of event that exists in a particular register of royal life, significant enough to matter, public enough to be seen, but not so large that it drew the full weight of national attention. Perfect, in other words, for a quiet repositioning. Charlotte was expected to attend. She had always been expected to attend. The question that the letter had tried to answer on someone else's behalf, was how she would attend, what she would do there, who she would speak to, what the evening would communicate about her role, her standing, her future. The letter's vision had been background, supporting presence, gracious, lovely, present but peripheral. Charlotte's vision, apparently, was somewhat different. Thomas again, the Thursday before the engagement. Here's where Thomas comes back in, and where the two threads of this story pull closer together. I wasn't at the palace that Thursday. I was elsewhere in the city, but I spoke later with a woman, I'll call her Diane, a visitor from Edinburgh who had been doing exactly what tourists do on a Thursday morning near Buckingham Palace, who described something that she mentioned to me only because she'd heard I was interested in the guards and their duties. Diane told me she'd been standing near the gate that Thursday morning, watching the changing of the guard, or the approach to it, when she noticed one of the guards. She described him as youngish, very straight, brown hair under his bearskin, doing something she'd never seen a guard do in all her years of visiting London. He was watching a woman. Not a tourist, not someone causing a disruption. A woman who was walking along the path that runs parallel to the palace wall, the path that people use regularly, perfectly normally, but walking it in a way that Diane said didn't feel like walking. It felt like calculating. The woman was elegant, well-dressed, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing. She paused at a point along the wall briefly, naturally, the way anyone might pause to check their phone, and then continued. The guard tracked her the entire time. Then, when she had passed, Diane said he did something similar to what I'd seen him do with the car. A small movement, a signal, subtle to the point of being invisible if you didn't know to look. I asked Diane what she thought the woman had been doing. Diane, who was 71 years old and had spent 40 years as a secondary school headmistress and therefore had, as she put it, a highly developed sense of when someone is up to something, Diane said. She was checking sight lines. I don't know for what, but she was checking what could be seen from that path and what couldn't. I thought about that for a long time. Sight lines, what could be seen, what couldn't. And I thought about a formal event, scheduled for the following Thursday, at a venue that would require Charlotte to travel from the palace. The phone call I overheard and shouldn't have. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters. On the Wednesday evening before the engagement, so 4 days after the park, 6 days after the meeting, I was at a small gathering at a private home in Belgravia. Not a grand affair. 8 people around a dinner table. One of those London evenings where the conversation moves faster than the wine and everyone knows enough about the right things to keep it interesting. One of the other guests, I won't describe him beyond saying he moved in circles that touched the fringes of the palace world without being fully part of it, stepped out onto the narrow terrace during the dessert course to take a phone call. The terrace door didn't quite close behind him. I was closest to it. I want to be clear, I wasn't trying to listen, but I am a person who notices things. It's both useful and occasionally uncomfortable. I heard him say, in a low voice that was trying to be lower than it was, "She won't be redirected. They've tried 3 times now and each time she goes around it. It's like trying to redirect water." A pause. "No, the engagement is still happening. She confirmed attendance herself, directly. That's the problem, they can't uninvite her without it becoming a thing." Another pause, longer. "Someone needs to speak to her before tomorrow night. Not a letter, not a briefing document, someone who she actually..." "Yes, exactly, but who?" Then the conversation dropped below what I could hear, and I turned back to the table and the chocolate thing that had appeared in front of me. And I sat with the strange feeling of having heard something that had added another piece to a picture I still couldn't quite see the edges of. Like trying to redirect water. I kept coming back to that. The evening before, a conversation with a driver. This part of the story I came to almost by accident. I was in a cab on Wednesday night, black cab, traditional. The driver a man in his late 50s who had been driving cabs for 31 years and had, as he cheerfully informed me, seen absolutely everything this city has to offer, most of it through this mirror. His name was Pete. I will use his actual name because he told me everything I'm about to relay without any instruction to keep it private, in the completely open way of London cab drivers who consider the back of their vehicle a confession booth that happens to be moving through traffic. Pete had, earlier that same day, driven someone who worked in a household administrative capacity. He was vague about the specifics, and I didn't push from a location near Victoria to an address in Kensington. During the journey, this person had taken 2 phone calls that Pete, in his 31 years of driving cabs, had learned to process in the way you process background radio. Present but not intrusive. But one phrase had caught him, he said, because it was strange enough to stick. The person in his back seat had said, during one of the calls, "She's already spoken to the guard commander. Apparently she did it herself, didn't go through the equerry at all, just walked over and spoke to him directly." Pete didn't know who she was. He didn't know what it was about, but he'd noticed it because, in his experience, People who went around the normal channels to speak directly to whoever was actually in charge of something. Those people, he said, usually knew what they were doing and usually won. He said this with the cheerful certainty of someone who has watched enough people navigate enough situations to have developed their own reliable theory of human behavior. I agreed with him. He dropped me off. I paid him, and I stood on the pavement for a moment in the cold October night thinking about a young woman who had gone directly, without going through the proper channels, to speak to the guard commander herself. Not through an equerry, not through a briefing document, not through the machinery of palace protocol that could be slowed or redirected or made to point the wrong way. Directly, herself, like trying to redirect water. The formal engagement, Thursday evening. I was not at the engagement. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you what happened there based on 3 different accounts. Margaret's, a brief conversation with a journalist who attended in a press capacity and is willing to speak only informally, and a description I received from someone who was in the room as part of the supporting staff and who I met, entirely by chance, on a train from Paddington to Oxford the week after. I'm going to put these 3 accounts together now, as carefully as I can. The venue was arranged in the standard configuration for that kind of event. A main reception room, a smaller adjoining space for specific conversations, a flow of guests that was meant to be managed by a combination of protocol and the gentle herding expertise of event staff. Charlotte arrived, and this, all 3 accounts agree on, slightly earlier than expected. Not dramatically early. 5 minutes. But 5 minutes early in the world of these events means something. It means you are already in the room when others arrive. It means you see people come in rather than entering yourself into a room that is already looking at you. She was by all accounts extraordinary. Not in a performative way. In the way of someone who had decided exactly who they were going to be that evening and had arrived fully as that person, without apology or negotiation. She moved through the room the way Margaret had described her, making each person feel momentarily like the center of the world. But that evening there was something additional to it, a steadiness, a quality of someone who is not waiting for permission. The journalist, who I'll call R, told me that at a certain point in the evening, a moment occurred that the room noticed without quite understanding what it had noticed. Charlotte had been speaking with a small group near the windows. One of the people guiding the event's flow, staff, in the background, doing what event staff do, made a small move that R described as one of those subtle redirections. You know, when someone sort of materializes at your elbow and just tilts the geometry of the conversation so you end up moving without quite knowing you were directed. Charlotte didn't move. She finished the sentence she was saying. She thanked the person she was speaking with. She turned. But she turned in the direction she chose, not the direction that had been suggested. Then she walked to a different part of the room entirely. To a group that, R observed, she had specifically sought out, because they were people who were connected to the charitable work that was the actual point of the evening, and they were standing in the corner being respectfully ignored by most of the room. She spent 20 minutes with them. R said, the room sort of recalibrated around her, like when you're watching a current and you realize the water is going its own way. There it was again. Water. What the guard commander later said. I learned about this through Margaret, and I'm going to relay it carefully. The guard commander, I won't name him, had been spoken to by Charlotte in the days before the engagement, directly, as Pete's passenger had described. She had not made a formal request. She had not issued instructions. She had, in Margaret's account, simply told him something. She had told him that she had become aware that there were people taking an unusual interest in the patterns of movement around the palace in the days before the engagement. She hadn't claimed to know why. She hadn't named anyone. She had simply said that she was aware of it, and that she wanted him to know she was aware of it, and that she trusted him and his team to do what they judged appropriate. That was it. No accusation, no demand, no request for a specific action. Just, I see what's happening, I trust you. Margaret said the guard commander, a man who had spent 3 decades in service and had, she said, the emotional range of a granite cliff when it comes to being surprised by human behavior, had reportedly found this affecting. Not because it was dramatic, because it was exactly the right thing to say, and the person saying it was 20 years old. Thomas Ashworth, standing at his gate, tracking cars and sight lines and the small wrong things that ordinary mornings shouldn't contain. Thomas was part of that guard commander's team. Thomas was part of the response to Charlotte's trust. 2 centimeters of hand movement, a radio call, a black car that drove away. A young woman, walking into a room full of people who wanted to make her smaller and filling every corner of it. These were not unrelated events. Friday, the morning after the engagement. The morning after the engagement, I went back to St. James's Park. Not because I expected to see her there again, just because it was where I'd thought about all of this most clearly, and I had more thinking to do. The lake was still. The pelicans were present and doing something that can only be described as smug. The bench was empty. I sat on it anyway. I thought about what it means to try to make someone small. I thought about the specific kind of effort that goes into constructing a cage out of tradition and expectation and elegantly worded letters. I thought about how the cage only works if the person inside it accepts the premise. The premise that the walls around them are simply how things are, immovable, normal, as natural as stone. And I thought about Charlotte sitting on a bench in the morning mist, crying without performing it, laughing at something unexpected, wiping her face with the back of her hand and standing up. Not because the difficulty had gone away. Because she had decided it didn't get to define the morning. The city went on around me. Joggers, pigeons, a child trying to feed a duck that was clearly not interested in being fed. I opened my notebook and wrote one line. Just one. I'll share it with you at the end of the story, not now. End of part 2. The story doesn't end with the engagement. I want you to know that before you move into part 3. What happened at that engagement was a beginning, not a conclusion. The pause that the meeting had created, the recalibration, the repositioning of pressure. It didn't simply dissolve because Charlotte had walked gracefully around every attempt to redirect her. In the weeks that followed, things became clearer and more complicated, and in some ways more beautiful if you believe, as I do, that the truth being told is always more interesting than the truth being managed. Thomas Ashworth would have one more morning that mattered. Charlotte would have one more decision to make. And Margaret, careful, measured Margaret with her sparkling water she never finished, would say one final thing to me that I've carried since. All of that is in part 3. But before you get there, sit with this. The most powerful thing Charlotte did in all of these days was not the meeting. It was not the document she brought to it. It was not the way she moved through a reception room, or the guard commander she spoke to directly, or the laugh in the park that escaped before she could think about it. The most powerful thing she did was refuse to become what the letter said she was. Not with anger, not with confrontation, not with a counter-letter written in its own kind of elegant hostility. Just by continuing to be completely, stubbornly, irrevocably herself. That's harder than it sounds. In that world at that age, surrounded by that architecture of expectation, it is, honestly, the hardest thing there is. The thing about London in November is that it commits. October is ambivalent, warm one morning, brutal the next, the light changing its mind hourly. But November in London makes a decision and sticks to it. Gray, damp, the air carrying a particular quality that isn't quite cold enough to be dramatic but is persistent enough to get into your coat, your boots, the spaces between your fingers. I was still in the city. I'd extended my stay twice by then, which I hadn't planned to do. There was something I was waiting for, though I couldn't have said precisely what it was. The feeling of a story that hadn't finished. The sense of threads still loose in the air. I was right to wait. 3 weeks after the engagement. In the 3 weeks between the engagement and what I'm about to describe, I had learned several things. The first was that the engagement had been received publicly as a success. That's a word, success, that in royal context covers an enormous range of realities, most of them invisible to the people reading the coverage afterward. The photographs were good. The charitable work was highlighted in the right publications. Charlotte had been described, in the language that palace communications use when they want to acknowledge something without quite saying it, as engaged and effective. Those 2 words, Margaret told me when I asked, were specific. Engaged and effective. Not warm, not gracious, not charming, the usual vocabulary. Engaged and effective was language borrowed from a different register entirely, and the people who understood that register would have understood the message. She was not background, she was not decorative. She was engaged and effective. The second thing I learned was that the pressure had not disappeared after the engagement. If anything, the fact that Charlotte had navigated it so cleanly had created a new problem. The problem of what to do with someone who has demonstrated, in public and on record, that they are not manageable by the usual means. Margaret used a phrase I've thought about often since. She said, "When you can't control what someone does, the next move is always to control what people think about what they do." Narrative, the management of story. And there had been in the weeks since the engagement a quiet effort in that direction. Not anything I could point to specifically, more like a reframing in certain conversations, a different emphasis in certain briefings, small things, the kind of small things that accumulate. The third thing I learned was about Thomas Ashworth. What happened to Thomas? Let me be honest with you. When I first heard this part of the story, I didn't believe it. Not because it was implausible, because it was the kind of thing that, if I hadn't spent weeks watching the pieces of this story fit together in unexpected ways, I would have dismissed as coincidence or embellishment. But I've thought about it for a long time now, and I believe it. 2 weeks after the engagement, Thomas Ashworth was reassigned. Not disciplined, not removed, reassigned. Moved from the gate rotation to a different posting internally within the same structure, technically a lateral move, not a demotion, nothing you could raise a complaint about, just different post, different assignment. Margaret heard about this through the network of palace-adjacent information that she had spent 20 years quietly cultivating. She told me about it in our third conversation, another phone call, this one in the evening, while I was sitting in my hotel room watching the November rain on the window. She said she had heard, and she was careful again about the word heard, that the reassignment had followed a request. A request from within the palace structure, not from the guard commander. He had apparently not been consulted about it, which was itself notable given that Thomas was his. A request from above that level. A request connected, she believed, to the fact that Thomas had been part of what had happened on that Tuesday morning, part of whatever it was that had caused the black car to leave. Someone had noticed that Thomas noticed things. And the people who had been in that black car, or who were connected to whoever had been in that black car, had apparently found a way to express that his particular quality of attention was inconvenient. Reassigned. I sat with that for a long time. The rain kept doing what November rain in London does, not dramatic, just relentless. The guard commander's decision. What Margaret did not know, when she told me about the reassignment, was what the guard commander had done about it. I found this out differently, through a conversation I had in the second week of November with a man I'll call Philip. Philip was ex-military, early 60s, had spent decades in service before transitioning to a consulting role that brought him into occasional contact with the palace's security structure. He spoke with the directness of someone who had spent so long in environments where directness was survival that he'd lost the capacity for the other kind. We met because a mutual contact thought we might have things to say to each other. We had coffee in a place near Whitehall that Philip liked because, he said, the coffee is terrible but nobody bothers you. Both things were true. Philip told me that when the guard commander received the request for Thomas's reassignment, the request that had come from above his level and wasn't accompanied by an explanation, he had done something that Philip described with visible admiration. He had complied. Immediately, without argument, without pushing back. And then he had done one more thing. He had gone, personally, to the person who had made the request, a person I won't name but who Philip described as administratively senior enough to make the request but not operationally senior enough to understand what they'd actually done. And he had said, very politely and very specifically, that he had processed the reassignment as requested, and that he wanted to note for the record that Thomas Ashworth had acted with complete professionalism in his role, and that the reassignment reflected no disciplinary concern on the guard commander's part, and that he would be happy to put that in writing if it would be helpful. The person who had made the request, Philip told me, had said that wouldn't be necessary. The guard commander had said, "All the same, I think I will,"